Hi everyone, and welcome to the first episode of season 3 of the Biome Project podcast. As usual, it's me, Robi, and Emma and Kate. And today we're incredibly lucky to be joined by the fantastic Becky Dudley, who is a marine mammal ecologist from the Hebridean Whale and Dolphin Trust. And it's very fitting we're recording this on Mull, where we've been seeing fantastic wildlife and some Hebridean whales and dolphins, actually. So we're quite lucky. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
No worries, it's lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's really exciting to have you here. Shall we start by maybe you just telling us a bit about what your job involves, what you kind of do day to day?
Yeah, so my main role is to lead our expedition surveys on board our research vessel Silurian. So we do expedition surveys all year round now, and anyone can join us on board, and I will train them up to spot cetaceans, to listen to the marine environment, and collect all the important data on the whales, dolphins and porpoises in the Hebrides. And then from that, collecting that data, it's preparing it and analysing the data as well. So that's my main role.
That's incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
So is that, when you say the Hebrides, obviously you're based in Mull, does that go all the way out to like Lewis and Harris, like all the wiggly bits on the side of Scotland? Does that
all the wiggly
area?
bits? Yeah. So our survey area is like pretty enormous actually. So we go all the way up to sort of Cape Wrath, so sort of northern tip, out west of the Outer Hebrides, as far as the Flannan Isles, and then to the south, out to a place called Stanton Banks, and then around Isla as well. So it's an absolutely massive area that we try and cover every year.
That's a huge area. And is it any like particular cetaceans that you're looking for? Is it just monitoring all kind of whales, dolphins, porpoises?
Yeah, all of them. So it's incredibly lucky that we have such an amazing biodiverse marine environment. So there has been 24 species of cetaceans recorded in Scotland, which is more than a quarter of the world's cetacean species.
Can you name all of them?
I could have a good stab at it actually, but not all of them. But we have about 8 that we most frequently see, from Harbour Porpoise right up to, if you're very lucky, a humpback whale. Harbour Porpoise are the most commonly cited ones that we see. So we're collecting data on anything that we see, anything that we hear, and then we also do photo identification on species that you can identify certain features from. So for example, dorsal fins, so the fin on the cetaceans' backs, or the fluke if it's a larger animal like a humpback whale, or even scarring and patterning on the side of their bodies as well.
So is it as detailed as you're going to like individual animals?
So we do what's known as line transect surveying. So throughout that massive survey area, we'll sort of zigzag through that area, making sure we're going over different depths and different substrates and just different ecological environments essentially. And we'll do that in quite a systematic way. So it's in straight lines, going between 5 and 7 knots. And it's collecting what's called effort corrected data. So we are visually spotting them at all times with 2 people stood on the mast, and we've done that the same way for over 18 years now, and that means that the data is collected the same way every single time, so you can start looking at trends and changes in the marine environment. But yeah, we'll note down any cetacean species that we see. We also note down any seal species that we see as well, so the grey and common seals that we have in the area. We note down any marine plastics that we come across as well. And also creoles. Do you guys know what creoles are? No. So if you've been out sort of looking at the coastline, you might have seen a lot of sort of buoys floating on the surface. Yeah. So they're part of a creole pot system. So you have one buoy that's anchored to the floor, and along are like lobster pots or creole pots. You might have seen them sort of on the coastline dotted about. They're collecting sort of crustaceans. So we also count any creoles that we see. And that's for looking at entanglement, mapping, and assessing what threats there might be in the marine environment as well. So we also do that, and as also count seabirds as well. So there's a lot going on the boat.
Wow. Yeah, and that's just with 4 people.
So we have 6 people can come on board with us each time, excluding 4 crew, so 10 people on the boats. And we work in sort of a rotationary system, so you'll be on the mast for a while, You'll then be on the station where you're counting all the birds and all the boats that we see as well. We count all the different types of boats that are in the area, so we can look at marine planning and things, and what sort of industries are going on in different places. And then someone downstairs in the data station who's looking at the marine acoustics, because we also tow a hydrophone on our surveys as well, out the back of the boat.
So you said 24 different species.
Yeah.
We're not going to get you to name them, but I can probably name 5 that I think in British waters. So I have no idea that the cetaceans in British waters, like, there were so many different species. So what particular ones are you likely to see? Like, what's the most common whale or dolphin to turn up?
Yeah, so the Hebrides has such an amazing biodiversity because of the different amounts of habitats that are here. So it goes to incredibly deep waters. So there's the Rockall Trough, which just to the west of the Outer Hebrides, which is a huge deep area that goes down to over 2,000 metres. And larger whales will use that as a sort of migration highway, which is why we sometimes encounter the humpback whales and things like that. But then we have a lot of coastal species that are resident to the area as well. So in terms of what you're most likely to see when you're looking out into the from the coastline, is Harbour Porpoise. They're the smallest cetacean that we have in our waters. They get to about 1.4, 1.9 metres in length. They are quite difficult to see because they're so small, and don't tend to sort of be as acrobatic as dolphins. So as soon as there's a bit of a sea state or whitecaps on the water, they can be quite difficult to encounter. Bottlenose dolphins is a really great one to be able to see in UK waters, not just in the Hebrides. We have 2 resident populations in the Hebrides, but there's also a resident population on the east coast of Scotland that you can see from the shoreline relatively easily. Actually, there's a resident population in Wales, in Ireland as well. There's a resident population, and also down in Cornwall, which is what I did my master's research on, is the bottlenose dolphins down there. And then common dolphins as well have been massively increasing in our waters. So they were really rare when we started our surveys back in 2003, but now they're the most commonly cited species of dolphin in our waters, and you can see like huge superpods of them, sometimes of hundreds of them together. They're really, exactly. They're really fun to see. They come into Valride quite a lot. And then in terms of baleen whales, so the humpback whales and the ones that have the baleen plates and the ones that filter feed. The Minky Whale is the most commonly cited whale in UK waters, and the one we encounter the most commonly here in the Hebrides.
Having this many cetaceans, like 24 species and a quarter of the world's cetaceans, is that a sign of like a healthy ecosystem and good water quality, things like that? Is that kind of what it is a good indication of? It
is a good indication of that. I think the amount of habitats is probably the key thing there, but in any ecosystem, the more biodiverse it is, the more healthy it is, and that's something we think is hugely important at the Trust and something we strive for. But it then becomes a bit more complicated because to keep that biodiversity in place, you actually have to make sure that each population has what it kind of needs, and that the threats to each population is being addressed, because what a harbour porpoise will need may not be the same as what a humpback whale needs. So you need just a healthy ecosystem in general. But what is so great about studying cetaceans is that they are known as sort of an umbrella or indicator species. And if cetaceans are doing well in the marine environment, then it does mean usually that the rest of the marine environment is healthy as well, because they're at the top of that food chain. So if population is doing well, it means that they are able to feed, they are able to breed, and they are able to sort of mate with each other and have all of those life stages met within that environment.
So that's really interesting. You said that they're like that indicator species, because we've been talking like a lot about this with the eagles and marl, which is kind of what we came here to focus on. But obviously that means actually the threats that face them can be quite disproportionately large as well. So in in the Hebrides in particular, are there like specific threats that you're kind of on the lookout for and things?
So great point actually is that when you're at the top of the food chain, you often it often means that you get that cumulative threat all the way through. So PCBs is a really good example of that. So PCBs were used in electronics and plastics and things, and they were banned in the 1980s, but it takes them a very, very long time to break down, so they're still very prevalent in the marine environment. And we do have a population of killer whales in that is most commonly seen in the Hebrides, known as the West Coast community. Now they're down to 2 individuals now,
Yeah,
and
we did a
they
podcast on those, I think.
yeah, it was they're pretty. It's a pretty sad story really, because they are going to go extinct within our lifetime.
Yeah.
Both of those individuals are thought to be quite old. John Coe in particular, which is the most famous of those individuals. Do you remember that name? Yeah. So
Is he notched fin?
he's got a
Yeah.
huge notch in the bottom of his fin. He's definitely the most famous killer whale in our waters. He's always on the top of everyone's bucket list. But there was one of the members was stranded in 2016, and she was called Lulu, and she was found to have 20 times the threshold level of PCBs, so that's 20 times the maximum in her blubber. So they have and it was found to be one of the most toxic killer whales ever. Around the world, so the UK really does have a big problem with that. And she was also found to never have been pregnant, and PCBs is known to affect fertility.
Oh wow!
That's why we think
It's
ultimately
kind of like a double whammy almost.
that is going to affect your immune system as well. So if any of those have had a disease, it's much harder for them to fight off. But the fact that she was never able to carry a calf, because that's usually how they get rid of, sadly as well. So for example, with the southern residents in Canada, it was found that it was the first calf got most of the PCBs, and the mortality rate for that calf was not great at all, because all those toxins were passed on to the calf, but the second calf then did much better because there was less of those PCBs.
Those kind of facts are so awful, because it's not just the PCBs killing one individual, but it's the chance of reproduction then. So it affects the kind of
Whole
sustainability,
population.
the future of the population as well. So that's
exactly. And it's also an invisible threat.
Effect.
I think invisible threats are ones that are much harder to communicate with people, I think, and get people on board and wanting to fight and do something about it. The other one with that, and something that is changing, which I'm really thrilled about, is the noise in the oceans and the acoustics of the marine environment. I think a decade ago even, there was a few people working on that, but it wasn't in public knowledge. And I do think that is changing, but I think you go to the ocean and everyone finds it quite peaceful, I think, and you're looking out to the horizon, and you feel your sort of worries melt away, or I don't know if I'm speaking for myself here, but it looks like this really peaceful and quiet environment. But actually, we tow a hydrophone behind us, so we're recording constantly what that's underwater soundscape is, and there's always something going on, and that can be lovely sounds like snapping shrimp. That we have on the bottom. So the snapping shrimp have this one enormous claw that they snap, and it creates bubbles that stuns the prey, so they can then eat it up.
Amazing.
Yeah, and at its source, it's incredibly
It's almost like a
loud.
mantis shell. I had no idea we had
They're
that.
really funny looking animals, so you often hear them snapping away, and it sounds a little bit like frying bacon. And then you hear dolphin whistles and dolphin clicks and beautiful sounds like that. But what we also hear is ship noise and sonar and ADDs, so acoustic deterrent devices that are on the side of fish farms. That's very prevalent along the west coast of Scotland as well.
We've seen a couple of fish farms.
Would
they be, so the ones on Mull, would they have acoustic deterrent devices on around them?
So different farms will have different devices, but the vast majority of fish farms will use these acoustic deterrent devices. It's hopefully something that is beginning to change and that they are reviewing. But what we've heard recently is that what they're recommending is that the ADDs actually switch frequency. So at the moment they're a very high frequency, and it has been shown to disturb harbour porpoise because they communicate at a very high frequency. So every single cetacean communicates at a slightly different frequency. So the bigger, larger baleen whales like blue whales will communicate at a very low frequency, so that their communications can cross oceans and they can find mates and incredibly exciting. Use this deep sonar channel, which is an area of the ocean that's a particular density and temperature that the sound then can travel in.
I had no idea that existed.
Yeah, really cool.
It's like a hotline to...
And
I
then
remember we talked about it once, about how a blue whale can talk to off Africa can talk to a blue whale off I think in the middle of the Atlantic, and I was like, what? That's so crazy.
So crazy. Yeah, they did an experiment oceanographers produced a sound, I think it was off the coast of South Africa actually, and then that sound was heard 3 hours later both in Bermuda on the east coast of the US and in Monterey Bay on the west coast.
Oh my god.
So
it travelled
all the
across.
way.
Yeah, so the sound was heard
bonkers.
on both sides, and so it's amazing. But Harbour Porpoise produce very high frequency sounds which don't travel as far. So the higher the sound, the less it travels. So it was shown, that the ADDs that are now high frequency affecting the Harbour Porpoise, they might go to low frequency, but then it means that it might actually affect the Minky Whales. So it's not a simple switch that you can do. But it is a very contentious issue, because you will go past we'll sail past areas of the coastline and it just looks unbelievably beautiful. We're everywhere in the Hebrides, quite frankly, but then you'll put the headphones on and you'll hear this. It sounds almost like a pneumatic drill. There's different types, but the one that we hear most frequently is just this really like sound, and it's like it can be incredibly loud. Sometimes we don't even need to put the headphones on to know that they're there.
And the point of that is to scare cetaceans away from the farms.
Scare seals.
Oh, scare seals. So it's not even for the whales.
So
it's an indirect thing.
it's a seal scare.
Okay.
So it's the disturbance of Harbour porpoises is like an unfortunate byproduct of that. It's not actually it's not the cetaceans that are the problem. It's the seals that get into the nets. And these salmon, it's an incredibly lucrative, expensive industry, and it's worth billions. So those fish are really precious. But that is an issue. We're working closely with a student at the moment who's doing a PhD on that, and has just released a paper as well. So if anyone wants to Google that, some extra reading on that. Yeah.
Well, we said this the other day, didn't we? That when you look out on the ocean, it looks the same whether it's dead or thriving. When it's just waves on the surface, whereas a terrestrial ecosystem you can kind of see
the decay,
and you can see. We've said driving around the pine forest here, you can see it's very homogeneous there versus the mixed woodland, which is much. You can hear more birds, you can see more insects, and you can see the biodiversity is greater, but you can't see that from the surface of the ocean. It looks the same, and it always looks nice.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless there's plastic, that's the only thing you can see. But again, only big plastic. You can't see the tiny little bits of plastic that are in there. And
that's a really good point actually, and it's something that is both incredibly frustrating but also really exciting. So, studying cetaceans is really hard because we only get a glimpse of what's going on at the surface, which is another reason why marine acoustics is so important, because it gives you that idea of what's going on beneath the waves. But it's also then means that there's so much left to learn, and that the underwater world is a complete mystery, and how they use that marine environment is something that we might never actually fully understand, because their world looks so different to ours.
And I think sometimes we think of it as such a separate thing, and sometimes I think marine conservation and marine science gets neglected compared to terrestrial science, because it's the sort of out of sight, out of mind. And in my master's course studying conservation biology, so a very broad discipline in 14 months, we had a marine conservation module, and on the first day he said, you wouldn't have a terrestrial conservation module, what would that even look like? But he was like, I've got 2 weeks, I'm going to try and teach you about marine conservation, but no one would ever set you a terrestrial conservation module because
it's all
and he was like, the oceans are massive, I'm going to pick things, and I'm going to miss out loads because I'm giving 2 weeks to talk about the oceans. Imagine getting 2 weeks to talk about
and that's so varied, and the majority of life on Earth is in the oceans as well. So, and there's so many different habitats and different environments. So I think discussing it, doing things like this, working out ways to communicate the science, I think is really, really important. And I actually didn't do any marine acoustic stuff before I started my job. My background was in photo identification and bottlenose dolphins. And what I'm trying to work out ways to do is communicate the problems of noise and getting people to care about marine acoustics as well, because I find it really fascinating, but I realise that I'm a wee bit niche at times, so it is making getting other people so it's like, how do you make other people care about that? Because I'm like, how does everyone not care about this? But, I am very lucky that I get to sail throughout the Hebrides and see the consequences and see how amazing it is every day, so it's getting that message out there, I guess.
We got a comment on one of our podcasts. I think we were talking about curlew conservation in Britain.
Oh, cool.
And someone, it was really cool because we're nerds. And, so one of our, not even a commenter, like one of our friends' siblings commented, it's a bit niche. So we totally get a bit niche. But speaking of bit niche, my favourite cetaceans have always been beak whales because they're so weird. And there seems to be like a new species popping up every 5 minutes in Japan or something.
Yeah, that's that new one we talked about.
Have we got any beak whales in the Hebrides? It's okay if not, because I know they are really niche and it's fine. But
so
if we
beaked
do,
whales are on the list of the 24 species that have been recorded.
Which ones?
Trews have been, curviers have
Ooh,
been.
those are the really
deep ones, because again it's the Rockall Trough. So on that list of 24 are stranded species as well. So I'm not 100%, I think maybe the Trews one was a stranded whale, but that Rockall Trough section, they are known to be there. So I would I've only ever seen, unfortunately, a dead Cuvier's beaked whale, and that was actually a mass stranding event.
Oh, wow.
So in 2018, over 100 Cuviers and I think predominantly Cuvier's beaked whales were stranded on the coast of Ireland, the Hebrides, and some in Iceland as well, I believe. And at SMAS, which is the stranding network in Scotland, they did some incredibly clever science and used drift models to show where that event probably occurred, because most of the whales were at a similar state of decomposition. So from that you can decipher when it was that animal unfortunately died.
And what would cause something like that?
So sonar. Military sonar is the theory. It's not something that is very easily
provable, I guess.
Yeah, or very easily, it's definitely that. A lot of the times you can, but there was military activity in the area that they were thought to have deceased. But to prove that, you have to look into their ear, and after a certain state of decomposition, that's quite difficult to do. But you can also look at gas bubbles in their blood as well, because what happens is they get the bends, which is what divers will get if they come up too quickly. And because they are such deep divers, if there's sonar, it might mean that they are under the water longer than they would have predicted to be, so that they then get the bends, or they shoot back up to the surface too quickly and aren't able to use all of their the evolutionary physiological stuff that they've been able to do to get rid of that nitrogen.
So why military sonar? Is it I assume it is different. So is it the sound? Is it the frequency? Do we know?
It's the frequency and the amplitude, so how loud that sound is. So it's mid-frequency military sonar, which is the thing that causes most strandings. So there was another one in 2004 in the Bahamas. There's an amazing book actually called War of the Whales that talks about that stranding, and a lawyer who took the US Navy to court. Really amazing book, and they were able, those carcasses were fresh, so they were able to look into their ears and show that it was acoustic damage that caused that. And they also are incredibly loud. So we just had a survey, the last survey I was on actually was monitoring the Joint Warrior Military Exercise, which is a multi-facet NATO exercise. So they have the Navy, the Army, the Air Force all involved in that, and they do use sonar within the marine environment in the Hebrides, and it is very loud. So on that, because we were towing on hydrophone, we were able to monitor those instances of sonar and how loud they were, and it is it's quite difficult to even listen to, sometimes, because what we do is we slow down every 15 minutes and get a real picture of the ocean soundscape, and I will rank all the sounds that I hear to how loud they are. And sometimes, I'll put it on once and actually it's so loud that it's like, this is actually going to damage my hearing, and that's from coming through headphones, not even in the water. And it's not, we aren't as acoustically dependent as cetaceans. If you look at how cetaceans use acoustics, it's how we see things. You know, we're visual species, they're acoustic species. So how they, hunt, how they mate with one another, how they communicate is all through acoustics, or the vast majority, is through acoustics. So yeah, sonar is a tough one, because obviously it's the argument of defence and all that kind of stuff, but it is incredibly harmful to cetaceans.
I mean, you mentioned the communication side, that you're trying to engage people and raise awareness about the threats. How do you think you could do that with something like sonar? Like, what could you do to get people engaged and realise that it is a problem? Because I think a lot of people would be quite shocked to hear that.
Yeah, I think it's putting the sounds onto a video format that is then visual, because no one will click on a sound file, but someone will look at a video on a social media platform, for example. And I remember putting a sound to a recording of killer whales. I was lucky enough to do some research in Canada with the killer whales over there, and there was an amazing joining of these different clans of killer whales that were communicating with each other, and it was absolutely beautiful. They had static underwater hydrophones there, and we were tuning in, and then this cruise ship came past. So slowly the cruise ship got louder and louder and louder and just drowned all the killer whales out, and then the killer whales weren't there anymore. And you play that to people, and people are like, oh, like that's really, really sad. And it's the same thing with sonar. And we actually had an artist on board our last trip who is doing work with cetaceans and underwater noise, and is going to try and she's working with a composer to try and communicate that as best that we would acoustically understand it. So my assumption there is that there's going to be sort of dolphin whistles and all this beautiful natural sound, and then sonar comes through. So I think that's the way to do it as well, is maybe put it over videos, because the other problem with it is that when people go and get underwater footage, you know, they want to get stuff that looks really beautiful. So quite often they'll take the sound out of it and show the video and then put like beautiful music over the top, whereas actually
you want to hear the
because actually, like, when you're unfortunately doing quite a lot of underwater work, you're usually doing it from a boat, or there's other boats in the area if it's particularly touristy. So what you'll be hearing is, you might get a few nice whistles, but there'll also be engine noise and things like that as well. So it's I think trying to get more people to be maybe a bit more transparent about that would be really great, and not wrap everything in this like nice little
Instagram bubble.
Instagram bow,
Have you watched, what was the film?
Oh, it's
I've been thinking about this for the last 5 minutes.
Annie Moyer's film. It's like
The Sound Above Nature?
Yeah, A Voice
like
Above
that?
Nature.
A Voice Above Nature,
Yeah.
I think it is.
Oh, I don't know.
And it was
in a very similar vein, it had all these kind of pictograms.
I don't know, so the only way I can describe it, so with a glass of water where you've got the vibrations like that, they played the different calls of whales and other cetaceans, and then they compared that to, like, you saw the water moving, the frequency of the boats, and so you were listening, but you're watching this pool. I don't know what the technology is called, but there's a pool of water, and they show the vibrations, and like you were just saying, they had this cruise ship, and then it was drowning out, and slowly you heard less and less of the whales, and the water was just vibrating more and more and more, and that stuck with, that was years ago. And I can still kind of see it in my head, that vibration of.
And I'd never thought about the magnitude of it before, because you know, as completely as you say, we're very poorly equipped to listen underwater. So whenever you kind of hear whales on a planet Earth or anything, you always hear, and then when you go underwater and you're swimming, you hear, but you never hear the comparison. But then this film used that kind of iconography, and it was like, okay, so the whales are making these ripples, and then the boats are making, and the waves are crashing. It was really stuck with me.
I mean, well, that's obviously it stayed with you guys, and again, that's using technology to make a visual representation of the acoustics. So maybe I should watch it and see if I can do something about it.
So beyond the kind of research that you guys are doing in the Hebrides, what conservation work is happening, and what are the kind of conservation statuses of these common or 24 species that we have?
Yeah, so every single thing we do, every data point we collect is for conservation purposes. That is what we strive for, is to make sure that we're facilitating lasting changes for the cetaceans in our waters. So the amazing thing about what we do and our data set is that it's long term. So like I said, it's been going for over 18 years. We've been collecting it in the same way, and also having that multi-tiered approach of visual, acoustic and photo ID. it means that we can assess trends and changes over time, because if you just to complete 1 year in maybe one area, all you're doing there is getting a snapshot of actually what's going on in to the right of where the boat is or to the left of where the boat is. There might not be anything, and then you're deciphering all that information from that one area. And similarly, that's the same with temporal changes or just focusing on that 1 year. You could have a really great year, and then from that you're then deciphering that all the cetaceans populations are doing really well, when actually that was a unique year. So by having that long term, you can really see what's going on year to year and get a full picture of what's happening. So all of the data that we collect, we will share with universities and PhD students, and really get in depth into what that data is showing us. We also give that data to governmental bodies such as Nature Scotland, and through our data, actually, we were one of the people that gave the data to the implementation of marine protected areas.
Oh wow.
We've got very strong feelings.
Kate loves a marine protected area. Oh my gosh, she's like
take MPA.
Yeah. Well, hopefully there's more to come from them, because there's some management measures that still need to be decided. But from that, from our data sets, as well as others from organisations like WDC, we were able to get these MPAs designated in certain areas, and there's also special areas of conservation for Harbour Porpoise, which was at the time the largest in Europe, and that covers sort of 80% of our survey area. And actually, when you look at a map of the from our data showing the density of Harbour Porpoise, and then look at the designation boundaries of that SAC, it's very clear how important our data was for the designation of that. The new MPAs, one of them, the Sea of Hebrides MPA, is a relatively large area from the west of Colin out to the Outer Hebrides, and then north and south of that as well, and that is for Minky Whales, and it's the first in the world for Basking Sharks.
Wow.
As well, because that's one species we haven't mentioned. It's not in the cetacean family, but we do get Basking Sharks in the Hebrides here as well, in quite large numbers actually, and so much so that there are scientists that come up here to tag them, because they know at certain times of the year that they are quite likely to encounter them. So the Baskin Shark, second largest fish in the world, and so lucky to get you can see them down in Cornwall, and Ireland's a really good place to see them as well. But in the Hebrides, it's usually a bit later in the summer, so you guys will just have to come back in August time.
Is that because they're moving north? Are they migrate? Are they following plankton blooms?
Following plankton blooms. So we usually see. So it's copepods is their favourite type of plankton, zooplankton that they seem to like. And there's an amazing guy that lives on Mull. I don't know if you've actually met him. If not, I'll try and introduce you maybe on Friday. Called Professor Plankton, and he's
excellent.
Brilliant.
You'll love him. Yeah, you'll have to go, and he collects plankton every morning and looks at it through the microscope. And he's been volunteering with Sea Life Surveys, which is a marine tourist operator that have been running for over 25 years. They're the longest running marine mammal tour in the UK, and he's been going out with them for 25 years as well. So he usually says, I've seen those copepods, the Baskin Sharks will be coming, and he'll let us know. And
an early warning system for the Baskin Sharks.
So it's usually the copepods, so it'll be the amount of light that the seas are getting that will kickstart that algal bloom, that then means that the zooplankton come along, and then there's more the fish, and the whole food chain kicks off basically. And actually in the last week there's been some satellite pictures of a huge algal bloom in the Midge, which is the area of water between sort of north of Skye and out from the mainland to the Outer Hebrides, and there's been a big algal bloom there. Hopefully that means that the Basking Sharks aren't too far away.
So on another kind of really niche level, basking sharks are really fascinating. I'd really love to see a basking shark. I've never seen one, and obviously your work is with quite a bit of it seems to be with baleen whales. Is there any, because they're both on the same food source? Do they partition? How do basking sharks and something like a minky, which might be almost similar size, maybe? Am I inflating the basking shark too much? And how do they coexist? Do we know?
Yeah, good question. The basking shark will probably they can get up to, I think the biggest ever was 12.72 meters.
Wow.
I'm plucking out the back of my brain. That might not be the exact number, but it's huge.
Yeah.
But the ones we get here, usually the biggest will sort of be about 8 meters.
Mm.
Minky whales can get up to 10 meters, but again, the ones in our waters would probably be a smidge smaller than that. And you're right, they are after the same food source. So the minky whales will be going after that zooplankton, but they also go after bigger food like sprats and the smaller fish as well.
Okay.
So they won't necessarily, they won't be sort of feeding exactly together or anything like that, but they will co-occur in those same areas, like the marine protected area shows. That area is protecting both minky whales and basking sharks, and there's certain areas like the Cairns of Coll, which is a set of wee islands north of Coll, where that food, basically the currents will hit the land and force all the food up to the surface. So the basking sharks could be here now, but they're actually just feeding underneath because they don't actually have to come up, because they're a fish species, they don't have to come up to breathe, whereas the minky whales do. So actually in the summer months, the food will just be further up in the ocean layers. So yeah, they don't seem to sort of coexist in that kind of
cool.
way.
I love niche ecology questions. It's like, something to think about all day long. I guarantee you I'll be thinking about basking sharks and minky whales for the rest of this
You love your
trip.
whales,
I love a whale. I love a niche whale. Yeah, that's great.
I'm right there with you. But the other thing as well is basking sharks aren't as, I wish there was another word, but aren't as intelligent as cetacean species.
Yes, more reactive and so.
Yeah, so the size of a basking shark's brain is about a walnut.
Oh wow.
So they don't really have that much awareness. So there'll be times that you're seeing them and they have their mouths open, which is when they're feeding. They just will sift through the water, so they'll passively feed along the currents, and they'll filter an Olympic-sized swimming pool of water every hour through their gills, and it's covered in a mucus that then traps all the zooplankton. But there are times when I like to call it in a plankton-induced coma, because if they're feeding, they are not aware of anything else that is going on. So I always describe it like as a vegan smelling bacon, and you just can't quite concentrate on anything else. So yeah, they've actually bumped the nose into boats before. If we've had the engine, turned off, and actually there's ways they feed in a zigzag, so we'll always try and position the boat away from that. But there has been times when I've been working on marine tourism boats that they're bumped in, because they literally have no idea.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's a food coma, essentially.
It's a food
essentially.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
You've mentioned Ireland and Cornwall a few times, and obviously we kind of wanted to bring awareness to the fact that we have this incredible diversity of cetaceans in the UK, because I definitely didn't know that, and I think a lot of British people are often very guilty, myself included, of thinking Britain's quite boring and not very biodiverse, and we've killed all our wildlife and nothing's left, and you have to go to Africa or Asia or America to get amazing wildlife, when actually I think this trip in particular to Mull has proved to us that that's complete
Really
rubbish.
big
Absolutely.
eagles.
In terms of marine, like cetaceans and other marine wildlife, is it largely the west coast then? Because it seems to be kind of Ireland, or is it kind of the UK in general?
I guess more biodiversity will be found on the west coast, but you can see incredible stuff on the east coast as well, particularly the east coast of Scotland and Northumbria area. They get really good sightings of white-beaked dolphins over there. There's the resident population of bottlenose dolphins that I talked about. They have minky whales. They get killer whale sightings over there as well, and Harbour Porpoise. So you can see some really incredible stuff over in that area as well. But obviously the North Sea its depth isn't as varied, so you haven't got those same different of habitats, and obviously that's also an area that's been very overfished over the years, which will affect those as well. But yeah, the west coast is usually and I have to say I'm also guilty of that. So when I finished my undergrad, I moved to New Zealand. I lived in New Zealand for 2 years, and I worked as a marine tourist operator out there, a wildlife guide in Kaikoura, which is one of the most incredible marine areas in the world. And it was a guide that I was working with, shout out to Ruth, who told me about mull, and she'd been working on sea life surveys for 6 years. And, you know, we were in the most amazing area like in the world, and she would not stop talking about the Isle of Mull. I was like, why does she keep talking about this place? And then when I moved back to the UK and this job became available, she said, like, you know, absolutely go up there. And I was just amazed to be able to see whales and dolphins almost on a daily basis. And then even going down and doing my masters, I did my masters down in Plymouth in marine science, and, you know, I had friends there who would, in doing the same course, you know, I would say, oh, I've just been guiding up in Scotland, that's what I was kind of doing before here, and they were like, oh, do you see much? And I'm like, yeah, like every day, every single day. And it's so true. Like some of them were aware that, you know, you can get a few whales and dolphins, but actually the scale and the amount of species and things is something that I really hope to be able to. I mean, you can see how much I keep talking about it now, so it's hard to shut up. So if you get me on the subject with anyone, I'll try and, you know, get them as passionate about it as well, because for me to see my first dolphins I saw were in New Zealand, I think so, which is just ridiculous. And then I've travelled to other places in the world, and it was not until in my 20s that my, you know, mid to late 20s actually, that I went to Mull and saw how incredible the UK was. So
if you had your top cetacean in British waters moment, and I know it's completely unfair to ask you to pin one. Okay, take as many as you want, but what are the big moments which you think, oh my god, that's incredible, and it's off the coast of Scotland?
I guess for me, my favourite species of cetacean are killer whales. I just think that there's a power and a ultimate respect that comes as soon as you see them, because, you know, especially after like reading papers about how intelligent they are and their family groups, and the fact they go through menopause and they have similar lifespans, I think you have this real connection with them. And I've been lucky enough to see, we think, 3 different types of killer whales in the Hebrides. So I have seen John Coe in Aquarius a couple of times. Actually saw him last month, which was amazing.
So
We'd been monitoring Joint Warrior, so we had seen nothing but rain, swell and military boats for over a week. And then we came down south and we had this really lovely flat morning, and it was this glint off this, and we were like, what is that? And then the fin, and you just always lose it. Like it's always a joke actually that I'm still the loudest person on the boat every time we see dolphins, which I kind of hold with a badge of honour. I was like, if there's cetaceans that come up and I'm not bothered, then that's time for me to maybe have a career change. And then there's another time where we saw a pod of 9 off Vattersae, so in the Outer Hebrides, and we still haven't been able to ID those individuals, and those photographs have been sent to scientists in Iceland, Norway, and in other areas of Scotland. So we think that's part of an offshore community. And then there's also the Northern Isles community as well, which are most often seen around Shetland and Orkney, that we saw as well on it was a horrendous day. The engine had broken down. So we were sailing into an anchorage, and I was just holding on to the sheet lines and just communicating with the skipper to sail into this anchorage, and saw this blow out the corner of my eye, and then this smell of fish came up as well, and there was just obviously herring all underneath us. They were feeding. So seeing killer whales is always the highlight for me. And then if I may just pick one other,
all day.
Please.
Go ahead,
I don't, because I actually would. Minky whales. Often people, when they look at what whale they want to see, it's usually like humpbacks, because they do the cool breaches and the pectoral slaps and all that kind of stuff. But minky whales, if you're very lucky, they sometimes do come and associate with the boats. And more often than not, it's juveniles, but they will come right under, they'll swim under, they'll show you their belly. They've been known to spy hop and even create bubbles. So that's always uber special as well, because that animal is, that I think that for me, wildlife encounters are always so much more special when the animal chooses to come to you. And they're one of the threats, I think, for cetaceans is is marine tourism in some areas where it's not very well managed. I know instances in Norway that I've seen that have been really actually very, very hard to watch. But if you just stop and wait, that's usually when you have those incredible encounters. And the minky whale coming up and sort of having a look and turning on to its belly, there's nothing like it.
Imagine looking into the eye of a whale. I mean, you're looking, and I feel like with a whale, sometimes you hold up a little yappy dog, you look into its eyes and there's nothing but elevator music. But I feel like if you looked into the eye of a whale, you'd know someone was looking back as well.
Especially like what you say with killer whale, there's that emotional intelligence. Like I think you can tell that it's just that connection.
There's someone in there.
Yeah, as a scientist, you try not to anthropomorphize like animals too much, but I think sometimes with cetaceans it's impossible. And there's another book actually, don't know why I started recommending books all the way through the podcast, but by Alexandra Morton, who's on the West Coast, and she talks about her life and how it's tied to killer whales, and has some incredible stories about how she studied this same population of killer whales for years, and then was lost in this fog, and this pod of killer whales came and swam with, and she thought, I'll just go with them.
They probably know
and
where
as
they're
they emerged, as she emerged out of the fog, her jetty in front of her house was there.
Wow.
Little things like that, and on its own, you can call it a coincidence, but she has like so many instances. It's an incredible book. Actually, had a huge effect on me, and I think. It's like I said, as a scientist you try not to do that, but also think it's also maybe a bit arrogant not to do that at times as well, and think that they aren't as intelligent.
I think
they're intelligent in a different way, like with the acoustic environment. We're never going to understand how that part of, or it will take a long time for us to understand that part of their brain and how they use that.
It's the idea that we sometimes are like we see ourselves as a part of nature, like away from it, when we actually are just fully a part of it. And it's that idea that we don't want to anthropomorphize animals because they are separate, but also we don't want to assume that they can't do things we can do. And we actually were talking about earlier, there are so many things that they can do that we can't do, and so
many scientific innovations that come from watching animals and come from studying them as well. Like for example, the Spitfire was designed from the fulmar, which is one of my favourite seabirds, and they do look like little Spitfires. So a fulmar is a relative, the albatross that you have here, and they're incredible birds, and they fly just so beautifully, and use the air so cleverly. And actually, if there's 25 knots of wind, the fulmar uses 0 calories to fly because of the way they're designed. They're so amazing, and that design of the Spitfire came from nature, and there's so many different instances
and
fashion as well.
Stripes, like that comes from zebras. Like we get so much inspiration from nature. And so we can't start putting ourselves completely apart from it.
My favourite one, which is also about whales, is I think someone's trying to redesign wind turbines by looking at the kind of shape of a humpback whale's pectoral flipper, and just looking at the kind of streamlining effect, and I think they're adding the knobbles on the front of it because they figured out that actually that's really quite useful for a humpback whale. So they think, maybe we should put it on a wind turbine to get it go round. And I was like, that's amazing.
That's cool. I haven't heard that. That is cool. Yeah, because they do have like obscenely big flippers, and you're just like, what are you using?
Slapping each other.
You mentioned wildlife tourism, and this was something else we wanted to ask you about, because we've seen different tour operations on Mull, and we actually recorded a whole separate podcast about eagle tourism on Mull.
You should be out already by the time everyone listens to this.
Yes, so you would have hopefully listened to that. If not, refer back. The whole thing about kind of the ethics around wildlife tourism, and because we've literally seen the baiting of the eagles happening, where we've watched the boat throw the fish in. And I don't know how the kind of wildlife tourism on the cetaceans, or just on the island as a whole, like, is it largely quite ethical surrounding the cetaceans? The kind of, you mentioned sea life surveys, we've been over 25 years, that's absolutely incredible. And obviously we've discussed the benefits of wildlife tourism, and showing people wildlife is massively important. And so is the kind of wildlife tourism around cetaceans, like, how do you feel about that as a scientist?
Yeah, good question. I think it differs everywhere around the world, and it's all about having laws in place, but also the understanding that we do have an effect, and that engines and all those unseen effects that marine tourism can have. I remember talking to James Fairbairn, who used to run sea life surveys, who I used to work with, and we saw an instance where like a boat just went straight into the middle of a pod of bottlenose dolphins, because dolphins have this thing of like, you see the videos of them bow riding, and I assume that this skipper just wanted to try and encourage them to bow ride, but it was just this lack of understanding, I'd say, that is incredibly invasive, and that if you went into a jungle and saw a bunch of orangutans, you wouldn't just run around trying to get a picture of them. Or even with bird watching, or I'm trying to think of a species that wouldn't be scared if you sort of went into, but do you know what I mean? There's a difference, I think, with cetaceans, that people feel like entitled to be able to go and have these incredible experiences with them. And like I said, it's often when you're sort of moving away and the cetaceans come to you that you get those best experiences. In Scotland, because it's such a huge area, there's not that many marine tour operators, that it won't be having a huge effect. We also at the Trust run a course through WISE, and boat operators can join us and learn about the species in our waters, how to behave around the animals, and all of the Scottish wildlife watching code that's in place. And WISE is run by Colin Speedy and is throughout the UK. And Sea Life Surveys is one of those operators that have signed up to that, as well as Hebridean Adventures and Hebridean Whale Cruises, and amongst others. Sorry for anyone that I've missed. They're all fantastic if you've done WISE. And that's also a really good tip, actually, if you're ever going to wildlife watch and going out on a boat, is to look at any accreditations they have like that. So in the UK, if they've done a WISE course, and in other parts of the world, other courses that can be run, or whether they say anything about wildlife watching code on their website, because that will show that they at least are aware of it and are perhaps listening to it. The other thing as well, you mentioned the benefits of marine tourism. I think getting people to fall in love with nature is incredibly important, but also the data that they can provide. So Sea Life Surveys is a really good example of, and the other two that I mentioned there as well, because they run in different parts of the Hebrides, but what they do is record sightings through, we have a community sightings network called Whale Track, and that's run through an app and also through our website as well, and anyone can download it. So actually for you guys, if you're on the coastline, or if you're getting the ferry, when you're getting the ferry back to Oban, what you can do is you can run an excursion mode even, and it'll show your track line on the ferry, and if you've seen anything. So even if you don't see anything, that is data. So not only are they showing sightings and the different species, but they often take a lot of the most amazing photos as well, because they're able to, they're going to hotspots, whereas what we tend to do is try and get a full picture of the whole of the survey area, whereas whale watching vessels will go to specific hotspots. So the photographs that they take of individuals, like their dorsal fins, is so incredibly important. So there is a minky whale called Nobble. He's the most famous whale in Scotland. He's got a little knobble on top of his dorsal fin, and he has been recorded over 50 times in the Hebrides and has been seen over, I think it's up to 18 years in a row now. It could even be more than that. So it's showing that the Hebrides is a really important area for minky whales, that this individual is seen in the same-ish area every single year, and without that marine tour operator we might not know about that information. And there's other famous whales as well, and Nobble has his own Facebook page. He even has a song that has been written about him, and people brilliant. Just love him. And so I'd say for things like that, marine tour operators are really, really important. But like I said, when I went to Norway recently, it was very hard to watch at times. There was lots of boats around the killer whales, and there's lots of swim with programs there, which is a whole different conversation, because at times when it's done well, there's it's not so bad. So for example, in Kaikoura, where I was mentioned earlier, there's a swim with dolphins program there, but there's only one tour operator out there that can do it, and they have a set amount of times that they can put people in the water. They have to do it a certain way, so the dolphins come to you, and there's only 2 boats that are allowed to be with them at a time. If the third one comes away, they have to wait, and that's it around them in a huge massive area. But in Norway there's so many boats, and I'm not sure that there is in fact there isn't a law of how to behave around them. and I found that at times incredibly distressing. Luckily, I went with a friend of mine, Steve Trullock, who is a skipper for Hebridean Marine Cruises, and he is very good brand whales, knew the area really well, so we could go off and not be in those sort of hotspot areas. But seeing there was one pod that had a calf, and there was all these boats around it, and I just found it like
distressing,
really distressing.
Yeah.
So I think you have to have laws in place, but you also have to have people understand why those laws are in place, and have signs in places like harbours, or we rented a boat for that time there, so maybe encourage people that are renting boats to even having like a little leaflet to sort of say what's going on. I think it's something that will maybe get more of an issue in Scotland moving forward if there are more and more boat operators joining. But luckily at the moment, the ones I've mentioned and others have come and done the WISE course. They know how to behave around animals, and it's more recreational users, I would say, here that would be more of a concern.
So I guess like on the flip side of that, you mentioned some really positive organisations and boat tours. What would be something that people could look for that would tell you it's not a good tour operator with a specific thing?
That's a tough one actually, because I think people are very good at hiding it. I would look at reviews. I would look at even their social media is a really good way of showing it. There'll be videos of maybe how they're behaving around animals. If you see an animal within 300 meters, you are supposed to slow down, and then you are supposed to stay 100 meters away. Yes, there are instances where the dolphins come to you and they come to bow rides, and there's nothing you can do about that. And actually sometimes you're like, especially when we're on survey and we're trying to get people to concentrate on the, and there's common dolphins with you for like 20 minutes and you're like, guys, come on now. But I think some videos can show that as well. And I think if there is anyone listening that does run a company or works for a company, if you have a photo or an encounter that is incredibly close and is spectacular, explaining the circumstances of that encounter, I think is something that people need to do more. And to explain maybe the focal length of their lens when they're taking photos, I think is also something that people need to do more as well.
With the eagles as well.
Yeah, and all wildlife photography actually, I'm guilty of doing it as well. You put a picture up. I usually try and for every picture I put up, explain some threat or something that people can learn about. But I think maybe it's like, actually, just so you know, we were 600 meters away. This was taken with a 300 lens. But looking at their social media, because I think the companies I've gone with before, you can get the tone of from their website and from their.
Well, I guess that's the kind of flip side of, you say that they hide it well if they are practicing kind of unethical practices. It's the same with kind of, I think, anything within conservation or sustainability. If you're doing it well, properly, and you've gone through the accreditations and you're doing everything as best you can, you will shout about it.
Great point.
It's easier to find an ethical brand or ethical company than to try and spot an unethical one.
Yeah, definitely. And also is looking at, so if you were coming to the Hebrides, looking at a conservation charity that you can then get in touch with and get tips from. So if you were then going to somewhere, say if you're going to the coast of Spain and looking for stations, are there any conservation charities that you can get in touch with and ask? That would also be a good tip.
Definitely. So I think the kind of last thing we wanted to touch on with you is about being a woman in conservation, because I think it's something that we're all actually really passionate about. We talked about on the podcast quite a few times, and I know that the Hebridean Whale and Dolphin Trust is quite female. There's a lot of women involved, which is amazing. So kind of just want to just talk about your experience as being a woman in science and conservation.
So it's really incredibly to be part of an all-female team. All-female team at the Hebridean Whale and Dolphin Trust. So it's really inspiring to and our team, there is the science team, but there's also an education and engagement team. Our finance officer is a female, our director is a female, our chair as well is a female,
and your skipper as well on the boat.
And our skipper, so our old skipper and both our new skipper as well are females, and incredibly strong, amazing women to work with. So that's really, really encouraging. I think working in conservation in general there's a sort of line, I think, with conservation and then science. I think once you get into the academic world, it's more I found it as a little bit more difficult, and I think it's to do with the prevalence of like imposter syndrome and confidence as well. That for me is from a personal thing, but also speaking to other people in the field, I know that for me, I would have to be, or I feel like I need to be an absolute expert in the topic before I am able to talk about it, which is incredibly tough because not everyone's going to be an expert in everything. And just because I'm not a world leader in something doesn't mean I don't know a lot about it. So it's making sure you keep telling yourself that. And I do think that imposter syndrome does affect women much more than it does men, and confidence in general, I think. And it took me a lot longer to get into this world than maybe it would have done if my confidence in my abilities was higher before now, I'd say.
Yeah.
So, because I did geography at undergrad, and then went off and because I was actually told by a career advisor not to do marine biology because it was really competitive and I probably wouldn't have a job. And I think with my being a woman and being with my confidence levels at the time, I listened. Whereas I think maybe, again, this is a massive generalisation, I do realise that, but I think maybe a male counterpart probably wouldn't have listened. And then did undergraduate, but still loved the ocean modules like way more, and then went to New Zealand and then got my first job on a boat, and then I was like, actually I think I could probably do this. But even then it was, doing my masters and I did a masters of research as well, so it was very project heavy, and having that continued like push and confidence on a daily basis I found quite tough. And also when you get into the academic world, it's still very much male orientated. So the marine conservation world, I say, is actually quite female dominated. In the cetacean world, it is anyway. We've got an all female team, and I know that when we hire and things, there is very very much still a disproportion of the amount of females compared to the amount of males that apply. But as soon as you get into the academic world, it's still, especially at the supervisor and professor positions, it is still male dominated, which I think can just affect the environment and affects how you feel your place is within that. It's something I still struggle with all the time.
It's a massive problem. I think conservation as an industry has a big diversity problem, which is going to continue as long as the discipline remains as underfunded as it does, because it's incredibly elitist, because you are expected to work for free at the beginning of your career. So it's got a big diversity issue from the start, and academia has a big gender inequality issue as well. I literally was told by a female professor, if you want to have a baby, do not become an academic. And she was having a baby much older and later in life, and she said the only reason she could do that was because her husband was happy to be a stay-at-home dad. She said otherwise I couldn't do it and get tenure, and she went back to work straight away. And she just said, you can't do it, they won't give it to you, they don't want it, which is crazy and awful and terrible.
I think academia, it's definitely still like a gender issue, but like you said, I think more in conservation, it's the diversity and the amount of underfunding, and the fact that you are, like you said, expected to work for free. Everyone I know in positions have volunteered. I was very lucky enough to have, and I always say this, like a supportive family. So I did, I got a job to get the plane ticket over to New Zealand. Didn't have a lot of money when I was there. I look back at it now and I was like, that was so stupid. But it's just like, it'll be fine. But because I had a supportive family, if something went wrong, I was lucky enough not to have to get their support, but I knew I had it if I needed it. Whereas I know other people that wouldn't have ever been able to do that. So I think it's a shame that if you want to get into conservation, that you have to be able to have the means to do that and have to have a family to be able to
we've talked about this so much, all of us. We just think it's such an unfair industry. Like all the other, if you have a degree, say in law, and as soon as you graduate, you can become a lawyer or a doctor, you will have a job.
There won't be a job waiting for you necessarily. You have to kind of either make it yourself or...
You'd never have a master's degree in economics and volunteer.
But
you can have a master's degree in conservation biology and you'd be expected to work for free.
Then also, even if you're at have a pretty high level position, you compare that to a high level position in another industry, and the difference is just like in pay, even when you get a paid job, is so like crazy as well. So
and the imposter syndrome thing is definitely, I think, something a lot of young people and women especially, do grapple with. And there've actually been studies on this, and I'm going to butcher all these numbers because I don't know them off the top of my head, but again, a professor, a woman who I have massive respect for, she's absolutely incredible, she told me this about this study because we were talking about it very openly. She was talking about applying for jobs, and we were asking, if you don't meet all the essential and desirable criteria, should you even bother applying? And she said yes, because she said apparently men, they did a study on this, they will apply if they meet something like 60% of the criteria, whereas women will apply if they meet plus 90%.
Yeah.
So she said apply, because they're applying and then they're getting the interviews, and you're not getting them because you're just not applying because you don't think you can get it unless you tick all the boxes, whereas the men are just like, And again, it's like, a generalisation, but it's
scientifically proven.
Yeah,
so I'm reading a book actually on confidence, which I totally recommend, and it's talking about the difference in confidence between genders, but also how certain people are predisposed to be more confident than others. And there was a study of Chinese mathematical students, and they all took the same test, but they had to, before each test, they had to specify certain things. So one of them was their ethnicity, and because they had to tick Chinese, they apparently then did better in the maths test because of the stereotypical stereotypes that are associated with Asian students.
Oh, wow.
But what I found also like incredibly interesting is when the female students had to tick that they were female, they did worse.
Wow.
That's
So
really interesting.
isn't it it's incredibly interesting that it's like just by stating your gender, and it is apparently it's not just confidence, you have to be a little bit overconfident. There is then a line where it's a bit too much. We all know people like that, but apparently it is overconfidence, and looking, there was also studies where it was looking at people's how they're perceived and who you would hire for a job. And it was not on their resume or their achievements. If someone had the same amount of achievements, if someone had more achievements but another person had looked like they were more confident, actually they were the ones that this study, all the participants was like, I'd actually hire him.
Yeah.
So it is that it's something that I think you have to work on if you struggle with it, and keep up with it almost on a daily basis. But I think sometimes when people, when you talk about gender and people are a bit like, it's not a thing, and and it's like you're looking at actual scientific studies that show that it really is still a thing. Definitely. And it's they talk about the way like females are raised and all this kind of stuff. It's really fascinating.
And women in science, there is a big rise at the moment of women in science, but it's historically women in science have been forgotten. There's a big history of men winning Nobel Prizes for the work women did, and it being a male dominated field, and it's changing, but it's changing very slowly, and it's
still changing very slowly. I think that's the thing. I think people but it's changing. But really so much slower than it should be doing.
And people will look at the raw numbers and say, but now there's this many women and this many men, and it's sort of similar, and so that's great. My undergrad course was pretty much 50-50, but it's the underlying issues of those women are more likely to have imposter syndrome, whereas those men aren't. And so it's not just about equality, it's more about equal in terms of there's this many women and this many men. It's getting everyone on the same level.
Positions they're in,
what positions they're in, how they feel, how they're treated within the community. And if in academia men can have a baby and that's not a problem, but women can't, then that's not.
And I would say for anyone starting out or doing anything, and it's something, and generally I'm talking and trying to listen to my own advice here, but when you see people on social media in certain positions and you think I could how do they do that, how do they get in that position, how are they that confident, all of those people will probably, or the vast majority of the people will actually be feeling the exact same way that you do. Imposter syndrome doesn't stop when you get to a particular level. It keeps carrying on, because I know talking to Kate previously about this, and I've said how much I struggled with it, and you were really surprised, and it was vice versa. And I think you look at everyone's most confident pictures and when they're feeling great, whereas actually I think it's trying not to compare yourself too much, or look at someone and being like, how are they so confident, why am I not like that? Well, probably not. They probably aren't. So
exactly.
So I think we covered a broad range of topics there, from awesome cetaceans and the incredible work you do to kind of women in science and that kind of conservation. So we just want to say thank you so much for your time, because we are massive wildlife and cetacean nerds. And it's a great opportunity to talk to someone who actually is in the field.
And it's very rare that I get to indulge my love for beaked whales to someone who also most of the time you're like, oh, do you want to talk about beaked whales? And people are like, what?
What? No, it's so lovely, and like you said, we keep referring to ourselves as nerds, but like nerds are the most interesting people. So to be able to sit around and talk about cetaceans, and yeah, I could talk about them for hours, if you probably realised. So yeah, it's been massive fun. So thank you very much.
No,
thank you so much for coming on. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, it's great to have the expertise and the local knowledge, and it's great to meet here on Mull and do this in person as well. It's really
and just a little, I guess, a wee tiny little plug at the end. Just that if anyone's listened to this and want to see cetaceans, you know, if you can get to any place on land to watch them and look at the relevant apps. But I'd also say if someone wants to get a bit more involved in the science, please look at joining us on board our sailing vessel. You stay on, we go to some of the most remote places in the Hebrides, and you'll learn all about how to collect the data. And you don't have to have any previous experience, and you can be from any age at all. So yeah, do look us up if that's something you're interested in.
Yeah,
I know that's what I'm going to be doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Me
Follow on
too.
Facebook.
Yeah, so it's the Hebridean Whale and Dolphin Trust, and it's here on the Isle of Mull in Tobermory.
Yeah.
And if you want to find more from Biome, we obviously have our website. So we are www.biome-project.co.uk. We are the Biome Project on Instagram, the Biome Project on YouTube, the Biome Project on Spotify.
We're the Biome Project on most things.
Yeah.
It's just the website that doesn't have the
We've made it as simple as we can. And if you want to find us on Instagram as well, I am Conservation Kate. We have Robi Watkinson Wildlife and Emma Hodson Wildlife. And Becky, where can they find you on social media?
On social media, it's Becky on the Waves.
And I definitely recommend following Becky because her cetacean photos are incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much, and we will see you all in the next episode.
See you next time.
Bye.